Hello, Environmental Policy 2 students. This is Dr. Conway back for week 11 on Regulatory Impact Assessment Studies, or RIASs. And they analyze the design of proposed new laws, regulations to determine whether they have various effects. Because in the development of all regulation, a major concern is obviously effectiveness in terms of achieving the regulatory objectives, but also efficiency in how that's done. So the RIAS assesses whether the regulation is effective as possible given current knowledge and capacity for achieving the main objectives of the government. Will it be cost efficient for achieving the government's main objectives? And if not, what changes in the draft policy instrument are justified or need to be made? And that's what a regulatory impact assessment does. And typically, when it looks at cost effectiveness and cost efficiency, cost benefit analysis becomes a major factor. And because when we develop regular policies or laws or regulations in government, any government, of course, a major concern would be to ensure that the objectives are achieved, well, at the lowest possible cost. So, and that only makes sense. We can't be developing, given how many regulations exist in the world today, advanced by governments. It would be a nightmare if they were all done inefficiently, or not taking into account negative effects, for example, on contradictions between two different sets of regulations, or costs that didn't need to be there to achieve the objective, and so on and so forth. And the RIAS considers effects on the regulated community, obviously, the industry or the group or the people who are being regulated. Also considers the effects on the regulatory community within government. How is this going to be implemented? Are the costs sustainable? Is it likely to be something that can be done effectively, efficiently, fairly, and so on? And then, of course, impacts on third parties are a key issue, because if you, for example, if you regulate a product and there's going to be cost implications for the industry, and those are going to be passed on to the public, either in terms of increased costs for the product or in layoffs, loss of jobs. So all of these factors are considered by the RIAS. With respect to industry, the major concern of a RIAS study is what new fees or charges will the regulated community need to pay, and are those sustainable? What new or additional compliance costs will be imposed on the regulated community, and how does that work relative to, say, competition from other countries, competition from other sectors, and so on? Are the techniques, technologies, and processes actually available to allow for compliance, or are we regulating things that simply cannot be complied with at this time given the state of technology, technique, or process? Will the regulations unnecessarily disadvantage the competitiveness of any one sector? What are likely effects on employment? If there's a problem in any of these areas, of course, the regulatory review process will look at those and try to mitigate them as far as possible. The public, of course, as I mentioned, can be impacts in terms of pricing of products, availability of products, but also on jobs, and the viability of communities. For example, if you're regulated very sternly the way we did in the past, in the 1970s, we regulated pulp and paper, let's say, for chlorine emissions or dioxin emissions from the use of chlorine. We could have moved in and regulated those all at once, but we adopted a phased approach because these pulp and paper mills are the main employer of these small towns throughout northern Canada. If we had moved so fast on those that those companies went out of business, we basically would have destroyed entire small communities and villages. Now, with respect to government, we're interested in a number of different factors. How will the regulation change the functions and operating procedures of a government department or a unit within a government department? Where will the plan, charges, and fees go? Will it help to cover regulatory costs, or does it go into the government's consolidated revenue fund? And the cost effects of these on all the government programming, including products and services delivered by the department for the regulation. What are the costs? Core functions, how do they change? What budgeting needs to take place, future requirements. I mean, if it's a phased regulation, we have requirements today, but we might have a lot more requirements into the future. and forecasting resource models is all of what a regulatory impact assessment study would try to achieve. Regulatory impact assessment studies are required in most governments today. They're certainly required in the Government of Canada. And industry and other stakeholders want these to be done because they want to know what the impacts are from the regulatory, not only objectives, but the design of the regulation and how it seeks to achieve those objectives and what the cost benefits would be, the cost benefit relationships would be in implementing that regulation. So it's important for you to understand this other broad policy framework like SCA, like EIA. Regulatory impact assessment studies are a prominent broad umbrella policy tool used in environmental policy. So make sure you're aware of that, and we'll talk to you again next week. Bye-bye now.